Every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
You're watching GB News. I'm Polly Middlehurst with your latest top stories. A former British soldier has been killed in fighting in Ukraine against Russian forces. Jordan Gately's family say he was shot in the eastern city of Severodonetsk. He'd left the British Army in March. In a statement on social media, his parents described him as a hero, saying after careful consideration he went to Ukraine to help. They added that both Jordan and the team were proud of the work they were doing and that the missions they were going on were dangerous but necessary. Protesters are demonstrating outside an immigration removal centre as the government prepares to deport the first group of asylum seekers to Africa. They shook the outer fence of the facility near Gatwick Airport, where people inside chanted "No Rwanda." An appeal against a ruling which allowed a flight to go ahead on Tuesday will be heard at the High Court tomorrow. Unions have criticised a potential government plan to change the law allowing agency workers to cover for striking staff. Major travel chaos is expected later this month after railway workers voted overwhelmingly in favour of industrial action in a dispute over pay, pensions and conditions. Writing in the Sun on Sunday newspaper, the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said they could also be banned from working overtime to make up for lost earnings during the strike. RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch told GB News the government shouldn't keep changing the law.
Well, it's illegal at the minute, isn't it? And Grant Shapps should defend the rule of law, but now he's threatening to change the law in order to break an industrial dispute. I don't think it'll have any particular effect. These regulations have been in place for a fairly long time. I think they were brought in by the Blair government and they've been completely ineffective. People are using these in disputes already, which is against the law. So rather than saying that he's going to change the law every time he's at a disadvantage, what he should do is unshackle the companies and fund the railways correctly so that we can have a settlement to this dispute.
The government says legislation to scrap parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol will not break international law. Due to be introduced in Parliament tomorrow, the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis says it will be both lawful and correct. The EU has already said changing the post-Brexit trade agreement would be a breach and there could be retaliatory action. Labour and Sinn Féin have criticised the move, but Mr Lewis told GB News the Good Friday Agreement will be protected and respected.
Fundamentally, what is stopping the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Executive getting back up and running. And at the moment, the way the protocol is working, the way the EU want to see it implemented, is fundamentally undermining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that has given us now 24 years of peace and growing prosperity in Northern Ireland. We've got to fix that. It's damaging for businesses and for people in Northern Ireland, and we've got to fix it. So we will be laying out tomorrow, as we said we would do, we're going to lay out some legislation tomorrow that will resolve those issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol in a way that protects and respects the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
The Business Secretary has ordered an urgent investigation into petrol station operators. It follows concerns that some of them may be failing to pass on fuel duty cuts. In a letter to the Competition and Markets Authority, Kwasi Kwarteng said drivers are rightly frustrated that the 5 pence a litre reduction hasn't stopped prices from rising. McDonald's has been rebranded in Russia after the fast food giant pulled out of the country over the Ukraine war. Under new Russian ownership, the first 15 restaurants have opened under a new name, which translates literally as tasty and that's it. The relaunch was disrupted by a lone protester with one sign saying, "Bring back Big Mac." The food is said to taste the same, but any reference to the American company has been removed. And lastly, the Queen has become the world's second longest reigning modern monarch. The 96-year-old overtakes Thailand's king, who held the throne for 70 years and 126 days. Louis XIV of France holds the title for the longest reigning monarch, with a run of 72 years and 110 days. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking mostly dry and fine for many, though there will be some scattered showers. Let's take a look at the details. Across southwest England, it will be dry and fine with sunny spells, feeling pleasant in the sunshine, particularly in the east of the region with highs around 20 Celsius. A similar afternoon in southeast England, where it will be fine and dry with sunny spells. Temperatures will rise to around 23 Celsius. There will be odd light showers across high ground in North Wales this afternoon, though elsewhere will be dry with sunny spells. There will be lighter winds across the northwest England. Then yesterday it will be a fine afternoon with some scattered light showers around at times, though there will be sunny spells in between. Across northeast England it will be a fine afternoon with just the odd isolated light showers at times, though there will be plenty of sunny spells in between, feeling pleasant in the sunshine. A drier and finer afternoon across Scotland than yesterday, with winds continuing to ease. There will be some scattered showers at times, particularly in the north and west, but some sunny spells also. The mix of sunny spells and scattered showers continues across Northern Ireland this afternoon. However, these will start to become lighter and less frequent throughout this afternoon and evening. The scattered showers across the northwest will continue to ease this evening to leave a largely dry night. And that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and this is The Political Correction. I'm Jenna Davison, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry. We are here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. Coming up this hour, we're talking about what's been a turbulent week for Boris Johnson, which started with him surviving the vote of no confidence. We're also discussing the High Court's ruling to send asylum seekers to Rwanda after a legal challenge this week. And Tuesday marks 5 years since the tragic Grenfell Tower fire. We're joined by a barrister and former firefighter to talk about the events of that fateful day and where we are 5 years down the line. And as ever, if you want to get involved in the conversation today, then please email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. Now, it's been a turbulent week for the Prime Minister, which started with him surviving a vote of no confidence. In his first Commons appearance since surviving the vote, Boris Johnson said he was determined to get on with his job, despite 4 in 10 Tory MPs declaring a lack of confidence in his premiership. In the wake of the vote, the PM announced plans to extend the Right to Buy scheme, which helped millions of people purchase their council properties at a huge discount back in the 1980s and 1990s. So, Paul, what's been your read of what's been going on in Parliament this week?
Well, when it comes to the Tories, Deanna, I mean, I never like to intrude on private grief. But
you'll make an exception this week.
I'll make an exception this week. I mean, the truth is, it's very kind of unseemly. you know, there's been blood on the carpet in the Tory party, and they love a bit of regicide. You know that as much as I do. The Tories.
You don't have to go far back through our history to see that, do you?
Well,
really?
exactly. They go in for regicide far more than the Labour Party do, which I think is sometimes not always a good thing with the Labour Party, to be honest. But look, I think in truth, Boris Johnson is probably a dead man walking. Actually, I don't see how any Prime Minister can lose the support so graphically, so openly of 41% of his MPs and not be seriously hobbled. I mean, I think the chances of his fighting the next election as leader of the Tory party are almost non-existent. And I suspect really it's just a matter of time. I think the problem is for Boris Johnson. I think I believe that he's got this sense of entitlement, which, you know, leads him to believe he's got some kind of God-given right to rule, and would probably be dragged kicking and screaming out of Downing Street, to be honest. So I suspect that he has got a bit of a bunker mentality. You know, I'm not going anywhere. I've won the vote, and therefore that should be the end of it. But the truth is, it's not going to be the end of it. When you've got a sizable minority of your MPs against you, I suspect it's just a matter of time.
And I think there've been talk amongst, supposedly in the newspapers, amongst some rebels about sort of vote strikes, which for the Tory party to be considering strikes is always an interesting one. I mean, personally, I think
you might find me supportive.
I know, for a change.
You're going to go in for strike action.
I think it's a bonkers idea because as MPs we're there to vote on legislation as it's put in front of us. So personally, it's not something that I'd ever support anyway. But I just thought that was an interesting one for you, Paul.
What I'm interested in is your statement during the week. Obviously, you released a statement saying that you didn't vote for the Prime Minister in the Commons. What were your reasons for that? Similar reasons to others who did the same?
Well, it was a big decision, as anyone should have treated it like a big decision. It's a big question we're being asked, and the country's in very difficult circumstances. For me, I think there's been this kind of perception that some of the Tories who voted against him have done it purely on the sort of Partygate thing, that we're being sucked into some kind of Remainer, mainstream media kind of trap, which I don't think is the case at all. I mean, for me, hearing reflections of my constituents and what they went through during the COVID pandemic and how disappointed they are with kind of what was going on in Number 10, that's one factor. But for me, it's the fact that, you know, we have this 80-seat majority. We have an incredible opportunity to really try and shape the country. Obviously, the country's in very difficult circumstances at the moment, and I feel we should be doing more. We should be being more conservative. We should be cutting taxes, really giving businesses the opportunities to thrive. And so, for me, that was kind of more of my reasoning for deciding to vote the way that I did. Now, a lot of people didn't share how they voted. It was a secret ballot, and I fully kind of respect their right to keep it a secret. But for me, you know, I had so many of my constituents asking me which way I was going to vote. It felt right to put that across, to be really transparent and open about it. And I think the thing that I found the most interesting, and I'm going to talk kind of directly to our audience here, has been some of the kickback I've got from some of our own viewers. I hope some of you are watching this morning saying that you won't be watching me on GB News anymore because you disagree with the decision that I made. But for me, that is exactly what GB News is all about. We are here because we believe that differing views should be represented. We believe that we should have open and honest debates. And we are not the channel that cancels people because they have views that we disagree with. So I sincerely hope, and this is my plea to you, stick with us. Stick with us because we are going to continue to have these debates. I'm going to continue to argue with Paul about all things to do with trade unions. Nothing there has changed, but we do want to hear from you. We want to hear your views. So do send us your thoughts on what happened this week. Are you still backing the Prime Minister? Do you think he should go? Let us know. Send us your views on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. Now, a report by Ofgem has found that power firms must improve their storm response after Storm Arwen left more than 1 million UK homes without power last year. The energy regulator said that emergency plans initiated before the storm were not adequate, and they recommended that firms should develop more robust mechanisms to ensure compensation payments are delivered swiftly and accurately. Well, joining us now to discuss the report is the Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, Greg Hands. Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. I guess first question is kind of what is government's response to the Ofgem reports?
Well, there's actually two reports, Deanna. There's one from government and one from Ofgem in tandem, released last week. It's a comprehensive review of the lessons from Storm Arwen. As you rightly pointed out, more than 1 million people were without power. 75,000 no power for 48 hours, as many as about 4,000, including some of your constituents, for a week or more. So it's a really serious disruption. I would say there's three broad areas to learn from. First is on network resilience. How do you make your electricity network more resilient and more storm resistant? Secondly, how do you deal better with customers in such a sort of a widespread power outage situation? Certainly in your area, Northern Power Grid, it's quite clear from the report, didn't do a good enough job on servicing customers in the immediate aftermath. And the third area is on compensation, making sure that people get good compensation paid as promptly as possible. Ofgem have added an extra 10 million in redress payments on top of the 34 million already paid in compensation. Some of the companies, the distribution network operators, are quite profitable. Northern Power Grid has announced pretty strong results recently. There's definitely the ability there to provide compensation for those customers, without power for more than a week. As you know, I was up your way, actually Rich Holden's constituency next door, and met with people who are really, understandably, really angry about being without power, with nobody really giving them a straight answer, for many days on end. So I think I would say broadly those areas: the network, compensation, and communications, Deanna.
On the compensation front, there's also a call, isn't there, for the power companies to voluntarily lift the cap if power outages go on for more than a certain length of time. Is that something that government could potentially look at making compulsory rather than voluntary?
Well, I think we've got a series of actions in our report, and we'll be making sure that all of these actions get delivered on. In terms of making sure that compensation happens, that is something which is a top priority for us. There are actions in our report and in Ofgem's report. We'll be checking really carefully to make sure that those actions are taken. At the moment, Northern Power Grid, for example, I think about 90% got their compensation within 2 months, but 2 months is in itself too slow. The storm, as you'll remember, right at the end of November, that basically meant that they didn't get. I remember you asked me in the House of Commons, I think it was your question, when are people going to get paid? Are they going to get it for Christmas? And we weren't able to say that people were going to get their compensation payment in time for Christmas, and that turned out to be the case. 90% got it by the end of January, but that still isn't good enough.
Completely agreed. And there's one area that I've had a few constituents, and certainly I've seen a few comments in media, that the Ofgem report in particular doesn't necessarily seem to address, and that's around maintenance issues and the kind of ongoing resilience of the network. So how is government going to step in there to make sure that we are as protected as possible from any future storms?
Well, I think what we're looking at, the direction we're going in here is instead of saying to transmission network, so the transmission, if you like, is the main kind of the motorways of electricity, and the distribution network, which, if you like, are the sort of side streets. How do you then distribute that power to individual homes, to communities, and so on? Before, the way it's been approached has been different things that need to be implemented. We've put different requirements on electricity network companies to approach things in particular ways. I think the way we're now going to move towards is looking at outcomes rather than taking measures and saying, sort of like almost like a box filling exercise. We're going to ask them to make sure that their network is resilient. One of the things about Storm Arwen was it was an unusual storm, the first of its kind in more than 40 years. A particular strength, duration of the wind, the particular temperature was quite important, and the fact that it was a northerly direction. So it came from an unusual direction. So all of those things combined knocked over a lot of trees. And the particular issue in northeast England in particular was a number of trees being knocked down onto power lines. So we want to make sure that the networks, instead of just, if you like, making some implementing some measures, they actually test, what is the resilience of their network in different scenarios. I think that is the better way to go to make sure that these rare events are not as impactful as Arwen was.
Brilliant. Well, Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. Greg Hans, Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, talking about the aftermath of Storm Arwen. Now, Boris Johnson described planned strikes by the RMT as reckless and wanton during Prime Minister's questions this week. It was after the union announced 3 days of national strike action, with over 40,000 workers expected to stage a walkout over job cuts and pay freezes. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has said he believes the strike should not go ahead, but his party have been accused of being conflicted on the issue, with Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy saying Labour are on the public side as well as on the rail workers' side. Well, we're joined now by RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch. Mick, thank you for joining us this morning. Now, there's been a lot of kickback, hasn't there, about your proposed strike action, saying it's going to completely shut down the country and put undue pressure on workers who are already facing a real difficult time because of the cost of living crisis. How do you respond to that?
Well, workers are facing undue pressure because their companies, including the railway, are not giving them a pay rise. The vast majority of people in this country, particularly public sector workers, have had wage austerity brought in by the Tory government, even since Osborne and the Osborne and Cameron duo, and people are suffering. They haven't got enough money. They can't afford to heat their homes. They can't afford to eat in some cases, and maybe they can't afford to clothe their children. So what's happening is that the business class in this country is putting people into impoverishment. We've also got the reward that while our members were working and Tory party leaders were partying, they've now been faced with massive job cuts. Thousands of jobs are being stripped. And in order to do that, they're going to cut back on safety standards. And we're also faced with what is essentially an internal fire and rehire, where all our conditions will be ripped up. So our members are angry, as are many other British workers, and they need a response to that. We need a pay rise, we need job security, and we need decent working conditions from companies.
A lot of the rhetoric, as you will know, around this dispute has been, especially from the RMT's critics, has been, well-paid train drivers simply out to feather their own nests even more. This is what this is about. I mean, that's a bit of a lie, isn't it? I mean, this dispute is encompassing a whole range of workers, many of whom are nothing like train drivers. That's my understanding. Am I right on that?
You're correct. I mean, this myth of the high-paid train driver and that every rail worker is in that position is a Daily Mail and Tory graft fantasy, and GBNews has no trouble putting out that myth as well. The vast majority of people in this dispute are on very modest salaries. The median wage of a railway worker that we cover is £31,000 a year. So they need a pay rise. That is not that is below the national average, as I understand it. It's below the mythical nurse that everyone points to. They're on an average of 33,000, I understand. And there's also this myth put about that somehow if a rail worker does not get a pay rise, that the bosses in this country are going to transfer that somehow to bin men and care workers and nurses and other people who are underpaid and are being exploited. The fact is, if we don't get a pay rise, the rail companies who made £500 million in profit last year, on the poorest year for the railway in history, will make even more profit going forward. And the railways will recover, and we need them to recover because they're an essential part of our transport future, both in terms of carbon emissions and getting rid of congestion and moving goods and people efficiently and cleanly around the country. So Grant Shapps needs to stop threatening people, keep changing the rules halfway through the game. We've complied with the anti-trade union laws, and we'll get on with our dispute if there's not a settlement. We're in constant discussions with the companies, and will be this week. We were last week, and we will look for a settlement that our members can live with. But at the moment, we've had no offers, and our members, many of them have suffered a pay freeze for 2 and 3 years, and that's not acceptable.
So, Mick, you talk about kind of being on the side of workers, and clearly you're there to represent kind of RMT union members. But what about workers in other fields who are going to struggle, if not find it impossible to get to work, may completely lose their wage packet? Like, how on earth do you justify this to them?
Well, our members will lose their wage packets. I mean, our members are going to lose 3 days' pay that week.
Yeah, but that's a choice to take part in the strike, though, whereas others are being affected without that choice.
I'll finish it if you like. You want me to finish or not?
You can be combative, Mick, but, I think it was a reasonable comeback.
Would you like me to finish the question before you ask your next one? OK. So all workers in this country need a pay rise. It's your government, I think you're an MP, who's driven down wages in collaboration with the employers. They have deliberately suppressed public sector pay. And if they hadn't done that for a continuous period, we wouldn't have people who are so poor they have to make a choice between heating and eating. We've now got a country where the average life expectancy is falling. That's the job of the Tory government that's brought that in. We cannot be blamed for other workers being exploited by bosses in this country, while there are more billionaires than we've ever had, and the rich have never been richer. Dividends are being paid out, profits are being recorded at record levels, and what business needs to do, the business community, is think about the exploitation they're imposing on people and give them a decent wage. Now, we're part of that, and I hope the labour movement can recover its founding principles that all workers united together deserve a square deal of corporate Britain. And I hope that other unions can rally around what the RMT is doing and stand up for the ordinary worker in this country and get them a deal.
But with respect, Mick, you didn't actually answer my question there, which is how do you justify taking away potentially other people's earning capacity here by stopping them from actually getting to work and accessing those opportunities? Because your workers have made a choice to join the strike, but others haven't.
Their employers could choose to pay them if they wished. That's the choice that the companies would make to deduct their pay, isn't it?
I know, but you're taking away their ability to actually access their workplace.
Well, are you saying that the company should deduct their pay if they can't get to work? Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes it happens. Sometimes people are on those sort of contracts where they only get paid for the hours that they turn up and do. It's a business's choice. It's an employee's choice to take a part in one of those contracts. But you are stopping them from getting to work.
It's not a choice. They're the only contracts that are made available, and the Tory government has made those very readily accessible to companies all over the country. So the gig economy, casual work, vulnerable work, precarious work, is all a part of the lack of legislation that continuous governments have failed to bring in to protect workers in this country. Companies don't need to deduct wages. They can give them alternate methods. They can give them lieu days. They can do all sorts of things. So they don't need to lose pay because of the RMT strike. It's up to the companies to make that decision. And it seems to me that the rhetoric that yourself and others are putting up is whipping up a storm against a legitimate, lawful industrial dispute that's very simple. If we get a deal on pay, if we get a deal on job security, and we maintain our conditions through negotiation, we won't have to have an industrial dispute.
So, Mick, there's this new potential plan now from Grant Shapps and the government to actually get agency workers on board to maintain some real minimal level of service. What's your response to that?
Well, it's illegal at the minute, isn't it? And Grant Shapps should defend the rule of law, but now he's threatening to change the law in order to break an industrial dispute. I don't think it'll have any particular effect. These regulations have been in place for a fairly long time. I think they were brought in by the Blair government, and they've been completely ineffective. People are using these in disputes already, which is against the law. So rather than saying that he's going to change the law every time he's at a disadvantage, what he should do is unshackle the companies and fund the railways correctly so that we can have a settlement to this dispute. And then he wouldn't have to keep running back to his backbenchers who are foaming at the mouth, virtually asking for effective industrial action to be banned in this country and emasculate workers all over so that they can open the way for more exploitation. And it's the same with everything. If they can't make enough money or the money they like out of the current legal setup, they'll change the legal setup so it can exploit people even more. So he ought to concentrate on something else rather than changing the law every other week.
Well, Mick Lynch there, the General Secretary of the RMT, joining us to talk about the proposed rail strikes. Now, coming up on the Political Correction, we are joined by Kelvin McKenzie to talk more about RMT strike action, so don't go anywhere.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Before the break, we were joined by Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT Union. And I'm delighted to say now we're joined by former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Kelvin, thank you for joining us this morning. What do you make of this proposed industrial action by the RMT?
By the way, I thought that was an absolutely shocking piece of PR on behalf of the RMT by the General Secretary there. His dissembling on most of these important issues was simply disgraceful. So let's just deal with what the country has done for the RMT and its 40,000 employees, 20,000 of whom have had pay rises over the last couple of years. And the fact that the train system even functions today is entirely due to the fact that the government has nationalised everything. And were it not for being nationalised, the train system wouldn't be there at all. So we're all paying to keep these 40,000 Herberts in a job. The bottom line on this is this. There is a pay rise to be had and a deal to be had. Everybody accepts that. These are difficult times. Everybody accepts that. And were the government to signal to the RMT, who are getting their pay rise, as you alluded to in your question, on the back of ordinary workers being used as the battering ram because our working life is so intrinsically linked with transport that if there is no transport, there's a very good job that our economy goes backwards and people lose their jobs. They are using ordinary people as a battering ram for this. Let's face what they face, right? First of all, there's no chance. They're asking for an 11% pay rise or something absolutely absurd, right? Secondly, 2,500 of the RMT workers are going to be laid off because their jobs are no longer required. Why are they no longer required? Because 25% of the passenger traffic is no longer going to the station anymore. Why? There's two reasons for this. The main one being, that some people with COVID don't want to do it, so that's a small one. But the other one is that people are now working in different ways. COVID has brought in an industrial revolution into our country. People are working 3 days a week rather than 5 days a week going to their office. They're going 3 days to the office, 2 at home, right? Now, this particularly affects London and the southeast because we uniquely across Europe have a commuter system where people travel huge amounts of distance in order to get to their place of work. That world has gone in the same way as I don't have to come to the GB studio in Paddington to give my rather centre-right views, shall we say. I can do this from my rather nice area of the country. So there is one other issue. The government cannot and must not pay this blackmail, because if they do, the queue of other state workers will be literally 10 times round the block. So they can't pay it. So a strike is going to take place. And as with the miners and as with Wapping, the government must stay strong, or the employers must stay strong, and they must win this battle. It is a painful battle. I feel sorry for the rail workers being involved in this. But as you listen to Mr. Lynch, you know where he comes from. He comes from the far left. And in fact, the president of the RMT is a long-time communist who sits on the this is the guy who wants to destroy our country, let alone destroy the railways.
Mr. Mackenzie, if I can just intervene there. I mean, I'm interested that you describe an 11% pay claim, which I'm quite sure the RMT would be prepared to negotiate on, by the way, an 11% pay claim as absurd. This is the politics of envy, isn't it? And I'm quite surprised to hear that kind of line from you, because I understood that you were very much a free marketeer. I thought you were a Thatcherite. I thought you were in favour of people using whatever abilities they had in the marketplace to be able to negotiate what they're worth. So my question to you is, why is it acceptable for rich people? If you let me finish the question, why is it acceptable for rich people and people at the top to be able to negotiate their worth? And you say, that's fine, crack on, that's what you're entitled to, that's what you deserve. But when it comes to ordinary working class people and trade unions, you say, don't give in. Let's take an authoritarian view and say, no, we're not going to allow you even to take strike action, which seems to be almost the line that you're taking.
Kelvin?
No, I'm saying take strike action and let them get defeated. Right? I was hostile to the miners doing what they were doing, trying to turn the lights out, but in the end they were defeated. And I think this is a matter.
And look at the price that was paid for that. Look at the price that was paid for that in terms of the decay that set in working class communities that relied on the pit village. Don't you look at things like the miners' strike and think to yourself, actually, we shouldn't really try that again?
No, that's rubbish. There were communities that were left to rot. I do accept that, and that was a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. The miners wanted to kill us and wanted to turn our lights off and wanted to turn the country into some rather bizarre kind of East European regime. The miners,
Mr. Mackenzie, the miners were fighting for their jobs and their livelihoods.
Right, one at a time, chaps. Kelvin.
As the miners were doing, and we must not allow it to happen. And were it to happen, and by the way, this idea that 11% you're talking about, old man, actually comes from the taxpayer, right? That's where the money is coming from. These are nationalised industries, as you well know. So I personally don't want to pay any more taxes to fund the RMT or its employees.
Well, I think it's obscene, frankly, that you can say miners were out to kill people when all they were trying to do is defend their industries and defend their jobs and their livelihoods. But let's go back to the RMT if we can. You can't, on the one hand, argue, as you seem to be doing, look, they shouldn't be going on strike because this is a vital service, this is an essential service. But at the same time say, yeah, well, it's an essential service, but we shouldn't pay them a decent pay increase. If it's a vital, essential service and the work that they do is essential to the functioning of this country, then pay them properly. Why do you object to that?
No, I accept that totally. The transport system in all its forms, right, is the way that industry works. I'm not against them being paid. I have said, and they have said themselves, that they're not prepared to make any accommodation on terms and conditions in order for them to earn any money. So you have some ridiculous arcane ideas which the management of the rail companies are saying have to be changed in order for us to prosper in a circumstance where our revenues are only 75% of what they were 2 years ago.
So what about people?
Let me ask you a question. What would you do if you were running a business that only had 3/4 of the revenues that it had 2 years ago? Wouldn't you look at making cost cuts, let alone giving pay rises?
Well, the RMT is perfectly entitled to set out its position and then get into a negotiation on that position, which they will do, and that always happens. What I'm interested
Do you think they will?
What I'm interested in is why you think it's okay.
They've called a strike for June 21, 23 and 25.
And there's a window, and this is how industrial relations work. I know a little bit about it. There's a window of opportunity between that strike, between now and that strike for those negotiations to take place. But what I'm interested is why you always seem to attack working class people, why it's always keeping working class people down. What have you said about all of the people who have made a killing out of the pandemic, the people who made a killing around PPE and stuff like that? What have you said about the fact that city bonuses have risen six times faster than ordinary wages?
Right, let's...
You know, what on earth has that got to do with it? It's a complete canard.
Because you never...
I don't know why you're bothering with it.
Chaps,
because you never talk about it. You're not interested in the fact that city bonuses at the moment are rising 6 times faster than ordinary wages. You're not interested in those sorts of injustices. You just want to attack ordinary workers defending their pay and conditions. It's what you did when you were at the Sun, and you're still doing it
Paul,
now.
let's give Mr Mackenzie right of reply, then we're going to have to wrap up. Kelvin?
Sorry, what was that?
Just said right of reply to what Paul's just been saying.
No, I'm not getting involved in the debate about... I am here to talk about the RMT, and it's as simple as that. I'll talk about other issues on other occasions, but the RMT is my sole focus here today.
Well, we know that.
Well, this has been a fiery one. Kelvin, thank you for joining us, and Paul, thank you for your feedback there as well. But we want to hear from you. What did you make of Mick Lynch, Kelvin Mackenzie, Paul Embry's contributions to this discussion, and what do you think about the proposed train strikes? Do you support the RMT? Do you think that the train strike shouldn't go ahead? Let us know. gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, Tuesday the 14th of June marks 5 years since the tragic Grenfell Tower fire, which saw 72 people lose their lives. The fire was started by a malfunctioning fridge freezer and spread rapidly due to the cladding and external insulation on the building. Joining us now to talk about the tragic events of June the 14th, 2017 and the upcoming 5-year anniversary is barrister and former firefighter Lucy Massoud. Lucy, thank you for your time this morning. I guess, firstly, what are your kind of reflections on the day itself? Were you actually involved in the incident?
I didn't attend on the day itself. That was the Red Watch. I was based at Chelsea White Watch at the time. But I remember waking up the next day to about 100 plus phone calls from friends, family, various colleagues, various trade union officials, etc. So I just remember getting down to the site straight away and just, it was just breathtaking. At the time, the building was still essentially on fire by the time I got there. And it was just really trying to speak with the firefighters. I spoke with many of them the day after, and just seeing the utter sort of despair on their faces of what they'd seen on the night that fire took place. And as much as they did try and help, and as much as they did save many, many people, they were very aware that a lot of people had perished on that day. And of course, that's something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And then, of course, the following days, it was just a sense of shock, shock within the community, shock within the fire brigade, just not knowing how something so horrific could happen in this country. Kensington is the richest borough in Europe. So for a building with that many people in, situated where it was, to be covered in illegal flammable cladding and for 72 people to burn to death in their beds is just unthinkable. That's something that you might think would happen in a third world country, certainly not this country. And it's just staggering to think 5 years on and we are still without answers. Those bereaved family members, those victims are still without answers to their questions. And this inquiry, this public inquiry that has been ongoing now for some years, whether it will deliver the bereaved families what they want, I don't know. I don't hold much hope. But yeah, this anniversary on Tuesday, as it is every year, is going to be a tough one. I remember a year on, I was actually at the 1 year anniversary with Paul Embry, who you're sitting next to. And we attended a church service, and then we did the silent walk. And again, we're just dealing with a community that was utterly still in shock a year on, and they're still in shock now, 5 years on. But they're starting to get angry now, understandably so. Every month on the 14th, there's a silent walk. I suspect that when the inquiry does conclude, if this community doesn't get the answers it wants, that silent walk isn't going to be silent for much longer. I think the community are going to start really raising their voices, and absolutely rightly so.
Well, Lucy, of course, the inquiry split into two elements. The first phase concluded back in October 2019, and some of those recommendations have been implemented by the London Fire Brigade and some by the Home Office, but you're part of the Justice for Grenfell campaign. What has your response been to kind of government action so far?
I wouldn't say I'm part of the campaign itself. I'm wearing an FBU Justice for Grenfell T-shirt. I'm still closely involved within the community, and of course, I always offer them my full solidarity. I would say 5 years on from Grenfell, and we know that at least 58 buildings in this country are still covered in the same type of illegal flammable cladding that Grenfell Tower was. Now, despite the law changing and requiring property developers to remove that cladding from those buildings, property developers have refused to act, or some property developers have refused to act, and there's still buildings with that cladding on. So hundreds of residents throughout this country living in those buildings, living in those death traps, are understandably in fear of their lives. And so they should be. I absolutely would be if I was living in a building that had the same type of cladding that Grenfell had on it. So my question is to those property developers and to this government, what will it take for proper action to take place? Do we need another Grenfell tragedy? Despite it already being the biggest loss of life in post-war history, it's utterly disgusting that we still have 58 buildings in this country covered in the same type of illegal flammable cladding that was wrapped around Grenfell Tower and led to 72 men, women and children burning to death in their beds.
How are your colleagues? Because obviously what people don't recognise sometimes is that incidents like that, horrific as they are, can have a profound effect on the emergency services attending them. What's been the response of your colleagues and how are they bearing up?
The discussions I had with them at the time, and of course I'm still close with quite a few of them. I pop into Chelsea Fire Station quite a lot just to say hello or to park my car, or if I'm just sort of having a mince up and down the King's Road, I still keep in close contact with them. But also I have friends who are based at both Kensington fire stations as well, so I speak to them. And it's just something that they will never get over. They are haunted by it. But of course, and you'll know this, Paul, it's not just the firefighters, it's the control workers as well. It's the control workers who are on the end of the phone advising those residents in Grenfell Tower who were literally listening to people die on the other end of their phone. We know since Grenfell, many firefighters and control workers have left the job, either gone off long-term sick and eventually been forced to leave the job because they've just not been able to cope with what happened on that night. But of course, however bad it is for those firefighters and those control workers, it's only going to be so much worse for those bereaved family members and those victims of Grenfell Tower and the community as a whole, who are, as I say, 5 years on, we still do not have answers. There are still people living in buildings that are not fit for purpose, that are death traps. We still have politicians who are shifting the blame. I said this the other day on GBNews, that we're 5 years on, and the only person who has lost their job over Grenfell Tower has been a firefighter, and that was Danny Cotton. And that's disgraceful, when it was not Danny Cotton who put that cladding on that building, yet it's the firefighters who, up until this point, have been the ones to shoulder the blame.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for joining us to share your insights this morning. Lucy Mahmood, their barrister and former firefighter, to talk about the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Now, since the beginning of the millennium, self-styled strongmen have risen to power around the world. That's according to Gideon Rachman, the author of The Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World. Well, we're delighted to say he joins us now to discuss his book. Gideon, thank you for joining us this morning.
Pleasure.
When and how and why did this new style of strongman leadership arrive?
Well, I think almost kind of too symbolically, it actually starts on the first day of the new century, which is when Vladimir Putin becomes president of Russia. That's his first full day in the office. And for a while, he's a kind of anomalous figure with his kind of personality cult, very macho style of leadership, contempt for other institutions other than his own ability to rule. But I think over the next 20 years, you then get a whole rush of them. You have Erdogan in Turkey, crucially, Xi Jinping in China, who even gets his own thought written into the Chinese constitution. Erdogan, Putin, Xi all abolished term limits on their presidencies so they can rule for life. And then you begin to see it entering the democratic world. I think Modi in India is a strongman ruler. And Donald Trump in the United States, very much so, is this kind of personality cult. I alone can do it, he says. He says that America is in a dreadful state and that he's the only guy who can turn it round. And after that, you get Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So really, you know, most of the world's most populous countries, for a while at least, are run by strongman rulers.
Completely new phenomenon, because going back throughout history, we can see examples of sort of strongman leaders, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a period, however, after maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall, when at least most of the big countries in the world, and that would include Russia, China, etc., they may not be democracies, but they don't have these kind of macho personality cult leaders. They tend to have more of a kind of collective leadership, and they tend to at least try to embrace independent institutions and so on. And I think that then changes really with the coming of Putin and then the bunch of Putin imitators who then come to power. And I think we're still very much in the age of the strongman, but it's possible that because Putin appears to have made such a terrible mistake with the invasion of Ukraine, that style of leadership so centered around a single individual and his judgment will go out of fashion again. And I certainly hope so.
Have you found that throughout kind of your research for this book that some of the sort of perceived stronger female leaders have felt they've had to kind of adopt that more masculine, macho style in order to get on?
Well, actually, you know, I would say probably there aren't that many female strongman leaders. And in fact, I think one of the characteristics of this phenomenon is it's a very male thing. And often it's a sort of backlash against feminism or against, you know, gay rights or whatever. I mean, Putin, for example, apparently said that he felt it was an insult that the Americans were sending women like Hillary Clinton and Condi Rice to negotiate with him, a deliberate insult. And, you know, he poses bare-chested and all of that, and makes a big thing about the decadence of the West, which he associates with gay rights, trans rights, etc. He says that shows that, you know, something's gone really badly wrong there. And, you know, similarly, Trump, you know, famously talks, you know, in very kind of obscene ways about his relationships with women. Berlusconi in Italy, these are very macho guys. Modi in India, actually, they make a big thing of the size of his chest. It's a very male style of leadership. And I think that's partly because it's kind of a cultural backlash. These are leaders who are what I call nostalgic nationalists. They tend to say, look, things were better in the past. We and the country can go back to make America great again, as Trump put it. You know, you go back to a previous era, which was much more socially conservative and more male-centered.
Mm. And you mentioned the kind of kickback to Putin's leadership style, clearly because of the situation in Ukraine. Do you think that the kind of era of the strongman leader is soon to come to an end?
Well, I think that would be premature. I think there's a chance, you know, because I think also that Xi in China is actually in trouble a bit because he's trying to extend his rule at the end of the year to essentially to rule for life, really. And unfortunately for him, the zero COVID policy in China has really gone quite badly wrong. They've had to lock down the whole of Shanghai, 25 million people for a couple of months. They're just trying to reopen, and now they've had another COVID outbreak. The economy is really suffering. And again, he really identified that policy with himself in the same way that Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, was very closely identified with Putin. So I think strongmen can get discredited by making a big mistake. The difficulty is they're very hard to get rid of. You know, everybody's speculating, will somebody in the Russian leadership move against Putin? But it's not that easy. And similarly, in China, very hard to get rid of Xi Jinping. So I think they're having that style of leadership is being discredited, but you know, they're hard to get rid of. And even in democracies, I mean, you saw Donald Trump attempt to essentially dispute the election. Bolsonaro in Brazil, who might lose this November, has already started saying, oh, well, this election will be fraudulent if I lose. These are not people who give up power easily.
Mm. And how much of that is linked to pure ego?
A lot. I mean, I think that, you know, Trump is probably the clearest pure narcissist of these leaders. But I think that they are people who encourage a personality cult. So that in India, for example, you know, Modi, I mean, maybe it's partly just a political style adopted by his party, but if you get vaccinated in India, the vaccination certificate you're given has Modi's face on it. And Xi Jinping, they've, as I said, they've incorporated his thought, such as it is, into the Chinese constitution. So, yeah, it's all about the single individual. But I also think there's often an element of self-preservation, because if, like Putin, you've been in power for 20 years, you've probably done quite a few things, you know, violence, corruption, etc., which would mean that if you step down, you're actually at risk. And so these leaders, because of the way that they rule, are very reluctant to give up power for a mixture, as you say, of ego reasons, but also just self-preservation. It's too dangerous to step down.
Well, Gideon, thank you for joining us this morning. Gideon Rackman there, author of The Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World. But that's it for the first hour of The Political Correction. Keep those views coming in. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews. See you soon.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking mostly dry and fine for many, though there will be some scattered showers. Let's take a look at the details. Across southwest England, it will be dry and fine with sunny spells, feeling pleasant in the sunshine, particularly in the east of the region with highs around 20 Celsius. A similar afternoon in southeast England, where it will be fine and dry with sunny spells. Temperatures will rise to around 23 Celsius. There will be odd light showers across high ground in North Wales this afternoon, though elsewhere will be dry with sunny spells. There will be lighter winds across the northwest England. Then yesterday it will be a fine afternoon with some scattered light showers around at times, though there will be sunny spells in between. Across northeast England it will be a fine afternoon with just the odd isolated light showers.